All right, so I know you're really interested in getting a clearer picture of U.S. involvement in global conflicts, and I think we've got some really interesting stuff to look at today. We're going to be talking about Ukraine and Israel, and we're going to be using two articles by Ron Paul from the Mises Institute as kind of our starting point. These articles are from May and October of this year, so very recent. The main question that Ron Paul is dealing with in these articles is whether the U.S. is about to get dragged into some major conflicts and what the potential consequences of that might be. He's coming at this from what he calls a non-interventionist perspective, which he's been known for, throughout his career.
Yeah, and what's interesting is how both of the articles are kind of sounding the alarm, but from slightly different directions. In the May article, he's using the situation in Ukraine to highlight the dangers of what he calls 911 diplomacy. Basically, he's arguing that the U.S., because it considers itself like the world police, often feels obligated to intervene in conflicts that are not actually in the national interest.
Hmm. Interesting. So that brings us to, the current situation in Ukraine. What's Ron Paul's take on what's happening over there?
Well, he paints a pretty grim picture. He basically says that Ukraine is really close to losing the war with Russia, and Zelensky is getting more and more desperate in his pleas for NATO to get involved, even going so far as suggesting strikes on Russian territory.
Yeah, he even makes a comparison to Vietnam, right? He's saying that Russia is not a pushover like maybe we perceived Vietnam to be back in the 50s. They have the capacity to hit back and hit back hard.
Exactly. And he thinks that a lot of the U.S. involvement in Ukraine is based on kind of a narrative of lies and exaggerations about how much of a threat Russia actually poses, which he sees as being very similar to the kind of rhetoric that led up to the Iraq War.
Wow.
So he's warning that we could be sleepwalking into a conflict with really devastating consequences.
And that kind of leads us to, I think, one of the most chilling points he makes, which is the potential for nuclear escalation. There's a quote that he pulls out from Victoria Nuland, who's a former U.S. State Department official, where she's actually advocating for the U.S. to help Ukraine carry out missile strikes deep inside Russia.
It's a really stark reminder of how quickly things could get out of control. And that's exactly what he's afraid of, is that these actions could provoke a nuclear response from Russia.
So you're saying we're playing with fire here?
Yeah, pretty much. He thinks instead of adding fuel to the fire, the U.S. should be pushing for peace negotiations and trying to find a way to de-escalate the conflict.
Okay, so that's Ukraine. But Ron Paul also sees some really worrying parallels in the Middle East, specifically with Israel and Iran.
Right. In the October article, he's criticizing the deployment of U.S.-had air defense systems and troops to Israel. For those who aren't familiar with that, it's the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System. It's a pretty sophisticated missile defense system designed to take out short and medium-range ballistic missiles. And Ron Paul sees this deployment as a potential tripwire that could drag the U.S. deeper into the conflict with Iran.
So it's like he's seeing the same dangerous pattern playing out again.
Yeah, that's his point. It's another example of what he calls 911 diplomacy, where the U.S. ends up getting pulled into these conflicts that aren't really in its best interest.
So what's his solution for Israel then? Is he advocating for kind of the same hands-off approach that he is with Ukraine?
Definitely. He thinks the U.S. should step back from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and encourage direct negotiations between the two sides. He sees the current level of U.S. involvement as being counterproductive and potentially even dangerous.
Now, he doesn't mince words when he talks about the U.S. media and what he calls the deep state, does he? He paints a pretty dark picture of how powerful interests, including the military-industrial complex, can manipulate public opinion to get people to support these interventionist policies, even when those policies might not be good for the average American.
No, he certainly doesn't. He really believes that this deep state has a vested interest in keeping these conflicts going, and that it has way too much influence over U.S. foreign policy.
So we got a lot to unpack here. We've got Ukraine on the brink, tensions escalating in the Middle East, and this idea of a deep state pulling the strings behind the scenes. Where do we even begin to make sense of all of this?
Well, I think the first thing is to try to understand the historical context that Ron Paul is drawing on. He's basically saying that the U.S. has this long history of interventionism,
Yeah.
and that this pattern has almost never actually served the best interests of the country.
So what are some of the specific examples from history that he points to?
Well, he goes all the way back to the early 20th century, like with U.S. involvement in World War I. He argues that was a mistake that had huge consequences, both for the U.S. and the world.
And he sees parallels between those early interventions and what's happening today in Ukraine and Israel.
Exactly. He's saying we're making the same mistakes again, driven by the same flawed assumptions about what our role in the world should be. He sees it as this kind of dangerous cycle that we need to break out of.
So how do we break out of that cycle? What's the alternative to this constant interventionism that he's criticizing?
That's where his non-interventionist philosophy comes in. He's advocating for a completely different approach to U.S. foreign policy, one that puts diplomacy, restraint, and respect for national sovereignty first.
So he's not saying we should just become isolationist,
Yeah.
that we should completely withdraw from the world stage.
No, not at all. He thinks the U.S. should still engage with the world, but in a way that promotes peace and stability rather than conflict.
But is that even realistic in the world we live in today? Can the U.S. really afford to take a step back when there are so many threats and challenges out there?
That's something he addresses head-on. He says the U.S. needs to be more selective about where it gets involved and focus on threats that actually directly impact its national security. He thinks we've overextended ourselves militarily, and that's actually made us less safe, not more.
So it's a more strategic and restrained approach.
Exactly. Prioritizing diplomacy and avoiding unnecessary entanglements, he thinks that's the only way to break the cycle of interventionism and ensure the long-term security and prosperity of the United States.
That's a pretty bold vision.
Yeah.
And it definitely challenges a lot of conventional thinking about what the U.S.'s role in the world should be. But if we're going to have an honest conversation about foreign policy, we need to be willing to consider all sides of the issue. And that's what Ron Paul is doing here. He's making us ask some tough questions and rethink our place in the world.
I think that's what makes his work so valuable. Whether you agree with him or not, he's raising some really critical issues that we need to be paying attention to. He's forcing us to think critically about the costs and consequences of U.S. foreign policy and to demand a more responsible and effective approach from our leaders.
So we've laid out the groundwork here. We've got his critiques of U.S. interventionism, his concerns about Ukraine and Israel, and his call for a non-interventionist foreign policy. But what's next? How do we actually apply these ideas to the real world?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Because Ron Paul doesn't just offer critiques, he actually proposes solutions. And in the next part of our deep dive, we're going to explore those solutions in more detail.
So you're saying he doesn't just point out the problem, he actually offers some ideas about how to actually change things, how to shift U.S. foreign policy. That's definitely more helpful than just, doom and gloom.
Yeah, for sure. And his solutions really come down to this belief that getting involved in these conflicts doesn't actually help the U.S. It doesn't serve American interests.
So what are the costs then? What does he see as the real downsides of this constant interventionism?
Well, he points to a few key consequences, both for the U.S. itself and for global stability. First off, he talks about the financial burden, like the huge amount of money that gets spent on these military engagements, trillions of dollars, that he thinks haven't made America any safer.
And that money could be better spent elsewhere, I imagine.
Exactly. He thinks those resources could be used to address problems here at home, like fixing infrastructure, improving education, investing in healthcare, real bread and butter issues.
Yeah, misplaced priorities.
Right.
But it's not just the money, right?
Yep.
What other downsides does he see?
Well, he also talks about the human cost, both for the American soldiers who get sent into these dangerous situations and for the civilians who got caught in the crossfire. He thinks the U.S. has a moral obligation to avoid unnecessary bloodshed, both at home and abroad.
It sounds like he's concerned about not just the immediate impact of these interventions, but also the long-term consequences, like what it does to global stability.
Yeah, you're right. He argues that a lot of times U.S. interventionism actually creates more instability. It fuels anti-American sentiment, and it ends up breeding new conflicts down the road. He thinks that a more restrained approach would actually make the world a safer place in the long run.
So if the U.S. were to step back, what would happen? Would it just be chaos? Like a power vacuum?
Not necessarily. He thinks other countries and international organizations would step up to fill the void. He points to the European Union as an example of a regional power that could take on a bigger role in resolving conflicts.
So it's kind of like a rebalancing of global power.
Yeah, you could see it that way. He thinks the current system where the U.S. is always at the center is unsustainable, and that a more multipolar world where power is distributed more evenly would actually be more stable and peaceful.
But let's play devil's advocate for a minute. What about the argument that the U.S. has a special responsibility to be like a global leader and defender of democracy? How does Ron Paul address that?
Well, he actually challenges that whole idea. He says the U.S. has often used this rhetoric about democracy and freedom to justify interventions that were really about serving its own interests. He thinks true leadership comes from setting a good example, not from forcing your will on other countries through military might.
So a more humble approach.
Yeah, exactly. Focusing on cooperation and diplomacy rather than military intervention.
But how realistic is that? I mean, it's easy to talk about non-interventionism, but isn't the world just too complicated for that?
That's a fair point. And he acknowledges that. He knows there will be times when the U.S. needs to use military force to defend its vital interests. But he thinks those situations should be rare, and that the bar for intervention should be set very high.
So it's like a last resort, not a first option.
Right. And any intervention should be carefully considered and strategically executed.
A more thoughtful and deliberate use of military force.
Exactly. Avoiding unnecessary entanglements and focusing on building a more peaceful and stable world.
Okay, but what are the obstacles?
Yeah.
Like, what are the biggest challenges to actually making this happen?
Well, one of the things he talks about is the influence of what he calls the deep state. You know, these powerful interests that benefit from the way things are now, from this interventionist approach.
So they have a vested interest in keeping things the same.
Yeah. He sees them as a major roadblock to any real change in U.S. foreign policy.
So it's not just about changing the minds of politicians, it's about challenging a whole system.
Exactly. A system that profits from conflict.
That sounds like a pretty tough battle.
It definitely is. But he thinks change is possible. And he thinks it starts with educating the public, making people aware of the true costs of U.S. interventionism.
So it's about empowering people to understand the issues and demand something different from their leaders.
Right. It's about shifting the narrative away from endless war and towards peace and diplomacy.
Okay, so we've got the goals. Ending 9/11 diplomacy, reducing military spending, and changing U.S. foreign policy rhetoric. But how do we actually get there?
Well, that's where his experience as a political activist and someone who's always challenged the status quo comes in. He lays out a multi-pronged approach that combines grassroots organizing, education, and media outreach.
So building a movement from the ground up.
Exactly. Reaching people where they are
Yeah.
and giving them the tools and information they need to become advocates for change.
And he thinks that kind of movement can create enough momentum to overcome the resistance of the deep state and force a real shift in U.S. foreign policy. That's a pretty hopeful message. But it sounds like it requires a lot of work, a lot of effort to change people's minds.
It definitely does. But he believes it's worth it. He thinks the stakes are too high to just accept the way things are.
So it's about recognizing the challenge,
Yeah.
but not giving up hope.
Exactly. It's about believing that a more peaceful and just world is possible, even if it's a long and difficult road to get there.
So we've got the goals, the strategy. But what about the specifics? What are some of the concrete actions he proposes?
Well, he talks about a lot of different tactics. Some of them are traditional, like lobbying and campaigning. But he also talks about more innovative approaches, like using social media to raise awareness and build a movement.
So using all the tools we have available.
Right. He thinks that combination of grassroots activism, education, and media outreach can create the kind of momentum we need to break through and bring about real change.
It's a hopeful message. But it also sounds like a huge undertaking. Do you think it's really possible to actually achieve this kind of transformation in U.S. foreign policy?
That's the million-dollar question. I guess only time will tell. But Ron Paul believes it's possible. And he says it starts with believing that a different world is possible.
It's a call to action, a challenge to think differently about the U.S.'s role in the world and to demand more from our leaders.
And it's a reminder that even the most complicated problems can be solved if enough people are willing to stand up and demand change.
So we've looked at Ron Paul's arguments and we've looked at some of the counter-arguments, and I think we've come to the conclusion that there isn't always a clear-cut answer to these, foreign policy questions. I feel like we've gone beyond just summarizing his articles, and we're really starting to think about what it all means.
Yeah, definitely. That's what we're trying to do with these deep dives. It's not about telling you what to think, but giving you the information and the different perspectives you need to form your own opinions. We've been focusing on Ron Paul's viewpoint, which is this non-interventionist philosophy, but it's important to remember that's just one piece of a much bigger puzzle.
So what if someone were to say, Ron Paul's oversimplifying things. The world is complicated, alliances matter, and something intervention is necessary. What would you say to that?
I think that's a valid point, and it shows why it's so important to look at all sides of the issue. Ron Paul represents a particular school of thought, but there are lots of other perspectives out there with different arguments for and against intervention.
But even if you don't agree with everything he says, he does raise some important questions, like at what point does getting involved in another country's conflict become our problem? When is intervention really in our national interest?
Exactly. And those are questions that every country struggles with. There's no easy answer. One of the things I find interesting about Ron Paul's work is that he really makes you think about the consequences of our actions, both the ones we intend and the ones we don't. He reminds us that there's a human cost to these conflicts, not just for the people directly involved, but also for American soldiers and for American taxpayers.
Yeah, he really emphasizes that financial cost. Trillions of dollars spent on wars. That, he argues, haven't made us any safer. Money that could have been invested here at home.
Right. And that ties back to his critique of the deep state. And who really benefits from these conflicts? He says it's often not the average American, but the military-industrial complex, the politicians who get campaign contributions from defense contractors, and the media that profits from war coverage.
So here's something to think about. If the U.S. were to completely disengage from all these conflicts, what do you think would happen? What role, if any, should the U.S. play in global affairs? It's a complicated scenario to imagine, but I think trying to think through those potential consequences is where the real learning happens.
Absolutely. And remember, there's no right answer. This deep dive was focused on Ron Paul's perspective, which is an important one. But you should always look for different viewpoints, weigh the evidence, and come to your own conclusions. That's what makes this whole process of learning and engaging with these issues so fascinating.
Because in the end, these decisions affect all of us. And the more informed we are, the better equipped we'll be to hold our leaders accountable and work towards the kind of future we want to see.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and keep exploring.